This episode marks a turning point for the podcast. When I started it, I channeled all of the amazing hustlers out there, those of us who blaze trails, fail fast, and build from scratch. After more than 30 episodes, the podcast still honors those mavericks and has evolved into a broader conversation about the future of work. As such, the podcast name is changing to The Future is Freelance. We have the perfect guest today for this relaunch, Matthew Mottola, CEO of the Human Cloud. For the podcast, this is less of a rebrand and more of a realignment with where we were already headed. But the rebranded podcast is just the first release of a more extensive rebrand that I've been undergoing for the last 2 months. So stay tuned in the coming weeks for more fresh thinking from me. And now let's get into the episode. Hi, Matthew.
Sarah, how are you?
I am doing great. I am really excited about our conversation today.
Can't wait. This is five plus years in the making. When did we first actually say, hey, what you doing?
I don't even know, but it's been a minute. I'm glad it's finally coming together, and it's perfect timing because as I've invited you to be the guest on the kickoff episode of the rebrand of the podcast. We're shifting from the Hustlers Manifesto to start calling it The Future is Freelance, which in reality is a name change that I think has been coming for a long time. That's basically what the podcast is, and what it's transformed into is conversations with folks from all over the freelance ecosystem. And so I knew that you would be the perfect guest to kick off this look into the future and what independent work looks like. So I'm not gonna introduce you. I'm sure we'll get into a lot of the reasons why you're the perfect person to be on this episode. But I'm gonna let you kick us off by telling us who you are, what is your work, and why do you do it?
I'm honored to be on, Sarah. And about me, so Matthew Mottola, CEO of Human Cloud. Human Cloud, we're an advisory firm, we like to say, at the intersection of technology and work. We do two things pretty good. Not going to say that pretty good. We do two things pretty well. The first is we help enterprises scale freelance programs. So large companies, we help them really scale a freelance workforce. And then we help industry, which is the platforms, the providers, increasingly government and investors now. But we help them also grow and access these large companies. And so because of that, we have this 30,000-foot view at what is freelance, where is it going, what's in the way. And so most people know us by our podcast or Forbes channels or content, and that's sort of us. And my background is I've been in it for it's all I know. So whenever I'll be at universities and they'll say, what's the key to success? I'm like, I don't know. I've been in this freelance game forever. I really have no skills besides freelance, but I've been in it for around 12 years, started as a freelancer. I was early at a startup called Gigster, was at Microsoft, then built a venture-backed company, sold it, and done everything in this space besides being a good freelancer. Never been a really good freelancer. But yeah, so that's me.
I love it. Okay, so let's just jump in on a couple of those things. I love what you said, that basically you've just been in this from the jump. You don't know anything else, and your skill set is freelance. Tell me, one of the conversations that I have with a lot of folks is the skill set that you have as a freelancer, which all of us have different skill sets, is actually not as important as the mindset of what it takes to be an independent. And so I'd love for you to tell us, what do you like when you say that's just the way it's always been? Like, what does that mean for you that's different from someone who works a 9 to 5 or is in a corporate environment? What is the differentiation between being an independent and now it's like you wear these multiple hats. You're not just an independent, but you're a founder. You were helping at the government and the enterprise level. What does that mean for you?
Good question. So I would say that the key difference with freelance and full-time, right? So we'll start with there, just like freelance versus full-time. I think the key difference is that you always have to have an elevator pitch. And so you always have to say in 15 to 30 seconds, something that gets a potential client to listen to you. And you always have to have what are those 1 to 3 either scoped outcomes or real business wins that you can drive for the other person. And I don't think so that's unique to a full-time employee, right? So a full-time employee, you can have a big, large resume, you can have a bunch of logos. And if you do good in the interviews, then you're good and you're set. I think as a freelancer, and this is where I'm going to differentiate, I don't think you're always pitching, but I think you really have to understand your value and be able to communicate it well. And I'm not saying, hey, freelancers, they have to go win work every day because I get really mad when people say freelancers are just entrepreneurs. I'm like, right, like in some way, but some freelancers actually have 2 to 5 good clients and they never sell those clients. They're always going up and down and their business comes through word of mouth. So yeah, so I'd say the big key difference is the elevator pitch. Now, where it comes with me, let's say there's no freelance, right? Let's say the freelance economy blew up tomorrow. What would I do, right? How would I pay rent? Okay, it would be along the lines of product and sales. And so I've built a couple companies, understand how to build websites, understand how to build mobile apps. I'm like half decent at it, right? And I can combine sales to build good things through digital products. So that would be my hook. And if I when and I've had to, right? Because I think one thing in freelance with freelancers, we're very adjustable and we're good at navigating and quickly pivoting, quickly figuring out what's gonna get that dollar. So for me, that's why I say if I was a good freelancer, we would not be talking, right? I would just be working and making 100 to 200 a year, really happy. But I just suck at keeping 2 to 5 good clients. That's where then I turn into like founder brain. But yeah.
I love it. It's something that you're hitting on something that I think about a lot, like the fundamental difference that being an independent or an entrepreneur in general, a founder, does for folks versus what traditional employment does. And one of the things that I think it forces us to do is really get clear on who we are and what our unique value is, because you can't do the elevator pitch, right? Unless you're like, this, you have to have a fundamental understanding of who you are as a human and an entrepreneur, your skill set, and you have to have an understanding of your unique value and how that connects to whoever you're talking to. And like you said, that's not really something, to a certain extent you have to like, hopefully those are things that other people in the world also know about themselves too. But when you're applying for a lowercase j job, it's not necessarily something that you have to do. Your resume speaks for you. And obviously in the interview process, you are to a certain extent selling yourself, but it's not the same way and at the same frequency that you have to be doing it when you are a business owner and entrepreneur, especially a business of one. And so I think you're hitting on something really important there. Plus that combination of sales, which I think, to your point, I sort of straddle both of those worlds of freelancer, where it's on one side of my business, it's all word of mouth, it's all referrals, it's all repeat clients. I never really had to quote unquote sell those people. And as my business has progressed and I've gone into different areas, sales and presenting myself is something that I really had to learn, knowing that like most of the way that I got where I was 5 years ago, I was like, oh, I never really had to do that before. And that's a completely different skill set in and of itself.
Yeah, and I'd add, I think the core difference between full-time and freelance, and I'm going to give you a little bit of the client side perception. And I'm going to make sure to put a caveat too that full-time is actually becoming more like freelance than freelance is becoming full-time. So in 2 to 5 years, and even in some companies today, once you start working, the label freelance usually goes away. So it's, hey, this is Sarah. Don't care if she's freelance, full-time, part-time, whatever. That's Sarah. But to start, the core difference is usually that a freelancer is optimized for impact and a full-time employee is optimized for stability and permanence. And so if you look at like traditionally, what has gone into, is this person going to be a good full-time employee? It's usually related to stability and permanence. Are they going to do what we say? Do they have the logos that we want? And a common term is, this person a flight risk, right? Meaning, are they going to have permanence? Now, if you look at a freelancer, all that stuff is gone, even though it stays, meaning it answers itself. And so a freelancer is optimized for impact, meaning they're getting hired because of a tangible outcome they can deliver to their client. They might work with that client forever, right? So like good freelancers work with their clients forever. So they do have the permanence. But the difference is they're optimized for impact, which comes down to they have to know the value they can deliver. So whether they are an SEO expert, a developer with Python experience, a mathematician, whatever it is, impact is the success criteria. Whereas with full time, it's a little different.
Yeah. I think that is so true. And it's something that I've been noticing. And in a lot of the conversations I've been having is this sort of the blurring of the lines. Like you said, full time is becoming more like freelance and freelance is becoming full time. I think that, and I obviously have a bias. So there are lots of amazing things that are important about full time workers. And I'm going to focus on the amazing things about freelancers because that's what I do. But I think that impact piece is something I think is really important and could be, is not could be, is being, I think, adopted and pushed on more and more in the full-time work environment where you are, and it's not even necessarily about specialization because I think you can come in with a very specific skill set, but ultimately what freelancers are being hired to do is adapt, to have this adaptability where it's, you know, how to come into a situation, read the room, and do exactly what needs to be done in that moment. And that doesn't, and that is what leads to that long-term success. Like you said, good freelancers. Most of my clients I've been working for since I started my company. I just keep working for them. But it's that sort of value proposition that I think is different when a freelancer is coming in. They don't need any handholding. They need virtually no onboarding, depending on what the project is in the context of the company. But you're like, I'm hiring a top tier expert to come in and do this thing for me, as opposed to this idea that we need someone who's I guess what I'm
Database.
talking around is, yeah, it's
You
like
can
the
be there,
catch
right?
22. Yeah. It's the catch 22 between you want something that's permanent and so you're hiring for something that's a little bit more broad. When in reality, if you're hiring for a specific skill set and plus this mindset piece that we were talking about in the very beginning, that person could be with you forever and be a much more versatile, whatever you want to call them, maybe ultimately employee or whatever. But it's that difference in the focus in the beginning.
Yeah, and I'd add too. So this is where in 12 years, there's been a lot of things that what's that saying? It's like your values loosely held, right? Like values strong, but something loosely held. There's been a lot of things that have always just gone back and forth with. And one of those is the empathy on the client side. And so I actually feel like commonly we talk about the freelancer side, but what usually gets missed is the hiring manager and the executive who's scaling through freelance. And the reality is, it is really hard. And their job description nowhere says hire freelancers. If anything, it actually just looks like risk. We call it a hot potato, right? It's whoever's going to catch the hot potato. Oof, good luck. It can get you in a lot of trouble and potentially get you fired. And there's a lot of risk, and it's really hard to hire freelancers in current state. And one of the things that you hit on is that freelancers, so it's this weird contradiction. Freelancers can come in, do the job, leave with no onboarding, right? And they can do the right work at the right time. So that's incredible. With that said, though, the leader needs to know what they want, right? They need to know what the results are going to be that freelancer has to bring on. Now, I say it's a contradiction because the best hiring managers, they do understand the goal they need to hit and they just give it to the freelancer, right? And they say, hey, please solve this for me, which looks a little more like fractional because it's usually, hey, solve the strategy and the execution piece. But with that said, there still is a lot of work that the hiring manager is taking on. And there is a paradigm shift that honestly, I don't know a better way to hit the head than to just have empathy. And that is when you have a full-time employee, man, you can tell them anything. So you know that I'll give an example of like our own podcast. If our own podcast producer was a full-time employee, I could be throwing them crazy ideas left and right, and they would have to do most of them, right? Or they would leave. As a freelancer, though, or as a hiring manager, the freelancer, I have to know what's in that person's scope. And rather than a do this, it's a please do this, or do I think they would do this? That is a paradigm shift, right? And it requires me to be not as lazy as if I just had a full-time team. Now, obviously, I think hiring freelancers is in most cases is a better option, but I also think we need to recognize that, hey, there is work involved with this.
Yeah. I think what you're also hitting on there, and maybe this will lead us into sort of one of the things we want to talk about, which is like the terminology that exists here. But as you're talking, in my mind, am thinking about, you said the word fractional, which I think is right. And then I think there's also this intersection and Venn diagram between like freelancer and consultant, because I think that there's almost, and this is true, this is nothing against the people hiring freelancers, because this is true for me in my own business. Most of us don't actually know what we want or what we need until we like start engaging in the process of being like, oh yeah, that thing, or that's what I don't want, or like you're hitting it on the head, or that's a miss, that's a win. And that's a struggle on both sides, because a freelancer coming in, just a true lowercase f freelancer, who they're just like, here's the thing, I need you to do this deliverable, go do it, come back, we'll check it off, I'll pay you, we're done. It almost never works that way, right? Because once you get into it, you're going back and forth. And that's where I think really good freelancers and shifting into this more like fractional type of role, which is how I operate in my business, is you're a really good freelancer, consultant, whatever word we want to use, which we can tackle that in a second. You're coming in and the first thing you're doing is helping people understand what they need, because that is going to lead to a better experience for both of you. But that, I think, is a sort of a paradigm shift. That is what consultants do, what fractionals do. That's not exactly what freelancers do. And so I think there's a time and place for that. I'm saying there's lots of freelance jobs that are pretty like straightforward, cut and dry. But I think the best freelancers that are building the most sustainable businesses and interacting the best, having the empathy for the hiring managers, are coming in being like, hey, let's get clear on this like scope of work together and make sure that we have an iterative process so that we're all getting the things that you need at the end of the day. And if halfway through the thing that you thought you needed changes, let's figure that out together. But you're hitting on that, like that's not necessarily the way that it's framed, and it always works right now.
Yeah, so there's a couple things. So the core problem is that this is not like Uber, right? And that's one of the big problems of this industry, is that the analogies used typically are not the right ones. So some analogies that have been used is, hey, we're going to enter a free agent nation, and it's going to be like professional sports. Eh, I don't know if society wants that. Second one is that, hey, this is going to be Uber for talent. You just hop in, you do the work, and you go. That is totally not the case when you're talking about B2B and knowledge or white collar work. Totally not the case. Usually not the case with any type of work. And a couple of examples that I have of this was, I won't say the company name. We invested over $3 million into how do we plug experts, i.e. freelancers, into certain software solutions. So think Microsoft Word or Word Docs or PowerPoint, you name it. And the idea was, okay, cool, we can provide Uber for PowerPoint experts. And conceptually, it makes total sense, right? It's, hey, you're in PowerPoint. It says, do you want a designer or do you want this done in a week? You click yes, and then boom, you're done. The reality was the match is like 2% of the actual work, and it requires all these lines of revision. So that's one contradiction. The second contradiction, which I actually think is the bigger one, is that the way that incentives are set up in corporate settings are really not favorable for freelance. And so one incentive is that if you are trying to climb and you tell your boss, this is what I'm going to do, I have no idea how I'm going to do it, but please promote me, you're not going to get promoted. And exactly what you just said, which is spot on, is freelancers can come in and tell you exactly what you need, but that leader that's doing the hiring, they can't tell their boss, boss, I actually have no idea what we need. And so I'm just going to go, this just, the incentives aren't set up. And so for me, I had a really good experience that I took for granted just because now seeing hundreds of enterprises. But so when I went to Microsoft, they did not say, hey, give us a headcount, give us headcount rec, tell us what you're going to do. No one knew the problem, and no one knew the solution. The solution was, how do we use M365 to help our company or our customers hire freelancers? And so I had the protection to basically say, I have no idea how to use Microsoft products, but I'm going to go hire freelancers. But that's not the case in most corporate settings. In most corporate settings, I would not have gotten promoted, right? I would have gotten fired by showing up and saying, I don't know. So there's a couple of contradictions, right? That when we look at, and this is where with our business, we get in the weeds more of the long-term scale. So not the one freelance project, but rather how do you do hundreds and thousands of freelance projects? But those are just two contradictions that you're like, ooh, freelancers, we need to come together and make sure we understand them and have empathy for these clients. And then clients, we need you to know that we understand this is what you're going through and this is how we've solved it.
Yeah. And that's why I think, and you and I have talked about this before, but that's why I think that all of these sort of stakeholders that are working at these various levels of the freelance ecosystem are so important, because you and I do very different things, right? And it's hitting on exactly what you're talking about, because freelancers, independents have to be equipped to have the skill set needed to do these kinds of complex interactions with clients, to have this best foot forward, to be able to be a thought partner. enterprise and corporate people who are hiring freelancers, their structure in most cases is fundamentally not set up to engage with like you're hitting on it that from both sides of the equation, there's a slight mismatch. And so we definitely need people working at the level that y'all are working at to make sure that we can have the think differently about the structures, the incentive systems, the way we're thinking about independent talent and talent overall, because independent talent intersects with in-house talent in a very important way. And that sort of lays the groundwork for freelancers to be able to do their best work. But if we're not working at both of those levels at the same time, then it's the future of freelancing is never going to happen because it has to happen from both sides.
Yeah, and you brought up a really good point before, which was on the term consulting. And that is such a good rabbit hole. But the implications that we see is, so if you were to say, hey, I'm a freelancer, if the individual says it, it's usually tough, right? Meaning the perceptions in the US, and the US is a lot further than other regions. So in the US, the perceptions are a lot better than others. But if you were to say I'm a consultant, there's a little bit of air coverage, and there's this reality that we have in our space, and that is no one gets fired by hiring Accenture. And that is just a sad reality that is true. Now, the way to get around this is to highlight your expertise, right? And to show the actual success stories that you have. But before we can do that, we are overcoming prior perceptions. And one of those is consulting equals good, freelance equals quick, transactional, or bad. Our answer to that is when we say freelance, what we mean is if it's digital native and if it's self-employed. That's it. But your point of consulting was really good.
No, and I think it's absolutely right because, and this is where let's get into the terminology of it because I think that it again, there's no word. I was telling you before that before we hit record that I'm at the tail end of doing this like brand refresh and I've been thinking a lot about terminology. Who do I work with? Do I call them a freelancer? Do I call them a consultant? Do I call them a business owner? Do I call them an independent? And every single one of those has like different implications and different people call themselves different things. And I think that is, I never called myself a freelancer. I always called myself a consultant from the very first day that I started my business because it felt like that was a level up, so to speak. And I think that from my perspective at the individual level, the types of folks that I work with, I think there's two sides where it's a sort of jailbreaking and unpacking this word freelancer and giving like reinvigorating and taking away some of the stigma that word may have. And like you said, the US is in a slightly different place. But also, I think there's this quote unquote consultant mentality that is something that the best freelancers have, where you're not, like we said, just coming in being a widget. Like you said, that's one of the like myths and like misconceptions is it's not Uber. You can't just, they're not widgets. You can't just plug someone in to plug a human into a job without any other context and it just works. But being able to come in and understand the context, ask the right questions, and be able to do better work because of it, instead of just being handed something and being like, hey, go do this, come back. But that, and then the other word that we've been saying is the word fractional, which is a word I've been adopting more and more in the way I describe my work, which I think goes in even level up from consultant, where you're more of this embedded, longer term member of a team or a company. Think you of the terminology, Matthew.
So what we say is, and this is when I go and win work, and also when the freelancers that we work with, we've yet to see strong pushback on this, but we've seen pushback. We say, whatever the hell the client wants to call you, they can call you. And so if it's a company over in Switzerland, they'll call you a borrow strategy. Boy, does that sound sexy, right? If it's other companies, they'll call you part of their center of excellence. Also, a little sexier, but so vague, right? Some companies will still call it a gig program. The Department of Defense, has a freelance marketplace called Gig Eagle. And the general that leads that, talking about 6 months ago, and he said, so what's your feedback, right? Give it to me straight, right? What's your feedback? And I'm like, well, this guy is jacked and double my size and whatever bicep composition. So I'm scared to tell him the truth, but screw it, let's go for it. And I said, I think your name is horrendous. And he goes, that's awesome. And he's, what do you think it should be? And I said exactly what we've been talking about. I'm like, gig is a terrible connotation. Yeah. And he goes, well, we didn't know that. And he said, but it reminds me of this quote that is it new or new to you? Meaning that for us, we've been starting this journey in 2012, but for others, they might be starting this journey the second they meet you. And so if they say gig, why not let them, right? If they're going to say gig and pay you $10,000, then let them say whatever they want, right? If they're going to call you the liquid workforce, elastic talent, flex pros, if they're going to call you that, let them call you that, is the way that we handle this. We say freelance as the word. We say that this connotates digital and self-employed. And the second you work with that individual, you'll stop calling them a freelancer. But the only reason that you care about this is because you know that it came through a technology/digital platform, is the way that it came through, and that this person's self-employed, meaning that you have less compliance risk. So really not sexy. The last thing I'll say on fractional, it's a good word right now, but what we look at deeper than the actual word is what's the industry forming around it and what are the companies actually spending on. There's really good fractional communities out there. And based off of our database, there's between 10 and 20 fractional focused platforms, but it's not necessarily uniquely different than freelance, meaning it doesn't move the needle. People aren't saying, sweet, we can do fractional instead of freelance. It's still lumped under the same bucket of self-employed and digital first. And what else will say, the big like call out to the fractional community is, there's no nice way to say it, they got to get off their high horse, meaning they are not different, right? Like you guys are just as good as every other freelancer. The difference is it generally does connotate coming in at an executive level. So, and whether it's fractional or interim, like interim's another word that could be used for it. And I mean that out of love, right? I mean that out of, it's, if you get mad that someone's calling you freelance instead of fractional, then all you're really doing is kicking yourself out of a budget that they really don't care if you're freelance or fractional, they care about the outcome. So that's the one thing. And then the last thing I'll say on, because it's related to consulting, consulting might not be the word in 2 years, right? Because there's already in the US and in Europe lags and Asia lags as well. But so in the US, if you say consulting, then it actually already signals that you're going to give them a PowerPoint and leave. So there already is a negative perception on consulting. Now in Europe, the call I just got off of, consulting is better, right? There's still a better perception that you say, okay, consultant versus freelancer. But in 2 years, I don't know. Maybe consulting is going to be just as dirty as gig worker.
Yeah, I'll tell you, it makes branding and and marketing for those of us that work with the self-employed very tricky because the terminology, and I'm 100% with you. I think that and I think we're both saying it is like the word is self-employed. And I think that has, which obviously is again not sexy and is again not the like the word that I think people are, but that is, if my grandma asked me what I do, I'm like, I work for myself. That's what I tell the lay person. So there's something about that. And I think the terminology that orbits around that is going to change in the context and is going to change over time, and all of it I think is problematic. I think none of it is perfect.
None of it's perfect. So we literally made a client, the meeting right before this was client putting on a big summit, and they asked us, they said, hey, what word should we use? Can you look at the copy? And my answer to them was, there is no one word. So instead of having one word, learn how to test and long tail things so that you can test out 3 to 10 different words. And maybe one of those words will stick more than the others, maybe, but still there's not one word that hooks. And to add complexity to this, is that some of the best freelance experiences are not just one freelancer. It's one freelancer that has a freelance network, but is able to manage the network. So like all of our content is done by a freelancer named Riley, who we love to death. And we don't know if he has 5 or 50 or 500 individuals doing the execution work in the background. And we don't care, right?
Yep.
Because we know that the work is getting done better than anyone we've ever worked with. We know that we're actually in check from a compliance perspective, because if the government says you've misclassified, we turn around and we say, look, these are the incorporation documents. They have multiple clients. They're marketing elsewhere. So that adds even more complexity when it's like, hey, you hired a freelancer? No, actually, we hired this bulk of outcomes that are damn incredible. And Riley's the one that we meet with every week, but then there's also 50 people we don't know, but we start to know as the work percolates. So, yeah.
I think that's the best possible. Yeah. I think the fluidity of it can feel tricky. But I think that's actually one of the best assets of it is that it's never just one thing. And it's able to shift and adapt depending on the person and the context and the outcomes. Okay, I want to obviously we could talk about this for days and days, but I want to hit on
Not the
one
whole check.
one final question, which this was your suggestion and I love it so much. Let's talk about the word freelance revolution. And before we hit record, you had said, is it a revolution or is it an evolution? Is it really something that is new and different, or is it something that has been the underlying stream of happening, and it's just been evolving over time? So let's touch on that.
Yeah. Okay. And your listeners know that we come from mercenaries, right? So the term freelance was, hey, let's go hire a bunch of mercenaries. They're freelancers. Not too good, right? If you're saying, hey, corporate CTO, CIO, we're going to get a bunch of militants into your mercenaries into your environment. Not too good, right? But so at the same time, though, self-employment has been the default for most of history. And not even self-employment, more so people owning their outcomes and being held to the merit of their work rather than just having a paper resume. So the question of, hey, is it revolution, evolution? Is it transformation? There's so many different terms. I would caution that unless you really need someone to be hooked in, the more the word sounds like it's either big change, big risk, you name it, the harder it is to drive adoption. And what I mean by that is the hardest part in getting a company to go spend $100 million a year on freelancers, even the ones that are spending $1 billion a year on external talent. And that's one thing that I left out is that there's already this external talent infrastructure in play. And it's been in place since the 50s when McKinsey and BCG and all these consultancies came in and said, hey, we know better on the outside. This is where we're really stemming from the current state of freelance. And for the past 20 years, not to get too geeky, but around the early 2000s and late 1990s, you start to see software and technology take over aspects of internal work. So you see like VMSs and MSPs, and then you start to see like contingent talent programs, contingent talent departments, you name it. So this is where we're really coming from, right? Is these people, these companies who already understand that, hey, we like working with external talent. Companies are mostly over 50 external already, right? Some are all the way up to 99% external. And what freelance is saying is this is a better way to handle external talent. Now, if it's startups and SMBs, then to be honest, say whatever you want because the real thing is, hey, you have an exact expert with no time to onboarding that opens you up to new locations and works really quick, right? Like, I don't know if, pick whatever, that's what they care about. If it's enterprises, they care that this is not new, that this is not risky, and that in 10 years, you're going to be here so that if somebody asks, why did you choose that vendor? You're not going to be gone. And you and I, being in this industry so long, it feels good to say, hey, like this is a revolution, right? This is a brand new way of work, yada, yada. We tend to actually say it's really not that different. It's more so the top performers today are starting to choose self-employment models. And it's more so just an adaptation of what your top talent wants rather than this brand new transformation. And there's two ways to get someone to do what you want. Scare the crap out of them or give them a carrot, right? To a carrot or stick. Our space has always struggled with the fact that we have a damn good carrot, meaning we're 10x faster, we're 10x cheaper, yada, yada. But the risk is so high that typically using words like revolution, you name it, look like a big ass stick and get in the way. So if we were to look at sort of the evolution of the space, and using the word evolution, I would say that the growth typically happens from relationships, typically happens from long-standing relationships and typically happens in bursts of successes rather than a quick hit. And this is why, if you look at our industry from a really macro lens, we don't have any unicorns, right? We don't have any Slacks or Ubers or Airbnbs or things like that. We have Upwork and Fiverr as two public companies, and then we have Malt in Europe as a comparable in terms of large and really successful. There's a couple others, but we don't have that massive growth that comes with like a Salesforce who did things like saying software is dead or like on-prem is dead. We don't have that. We have very good client-driven, relationship-driven, both freelancers and freelance solutions. So that's a lot of words to say that we typically say evolution rather than revolution or something that's big, just because it's a heavy lift to even say, hey, start thinking about this. And we know that. And we know that. And so we're going to de-risk it and we're going to mitigate the risk for you. So I know that's like super boring, right, Sarah? Like, wow, that's not a sexy AI is going to come and replace it and yada yada. But that's the way that we've seen this industry mature.
No, I think there's so many things to hit on there. So I'm going to try and not go down a million rabbit holes. But the thing that I the thing that I want to connect back to that you're saying is it's this intersection, I think, that both of us, and again, you and I talked about this a lot, where it's like we operate on like different ends of the spectrum of the freelance ecosystem. I mostly work with individual freelancers, and you're working at the not just the enterprise level, but like the government level and the high level infrastructure of the demand side. So the supply side and the demand side of the sorry. Yes.
The buyers, right?
Well, I guess you could flip flop those either way.
Yeah.
Yes, the buyers and the independent talent. And if we're not, I think that the reason why this conversation and all of the conversations that I get to have with folks like you on the podcast are so important is because it can't just be one thing. So if I'm only here talking to freelancers saying, hey, this is how you get more clients, this is how you get paid more, this is how you deal with difficult clients, like the low hanging, for lack of a better word, clickbaity type of like podcast titles, right? Episode titles. That's not
Make
going to
make five
fix
hundred thousand dollars on X platform, right? Like
exactly,
we all
exactly.
there's plenty of clickbait.
Here's the top 5 jobs that'll take you 20 hours and you'll make 6 figures.
Yeah.
Maybe the transcript will pick up some SEO for me just like saying those words. But that's not going to fix anything. And you and on your end, being if you are there, which you're not, being like, yeah, it's totally like Uber. They're just widgets. We're just going to plug them in, like all those things. That's also not going to fix anything. And so the evolution is recognizing the bright spots on both sides and the ways that both ends of this market need to learn from each other and adapt, not just adapt towards each other, but also push one another to think differently about it, because that's the only way that it's going to move forward. And like we said before, too, it's not just about independence. Like my MO is let's make work better for everyone. I work specifically with independence, that I'm not here to, my work in this world is that, but hopefully work is better for everyone. And some of the things you're saying is like, not just post COVID, but for sure post COVID, especially top tier talent is this is bullshit. I'm too good at this. And now I know that life is too short for me to just deal with the bureaucracy when I can go out on my own and work from home, work 20 hours a week, still make multiple 6 figures. So we both got to find the intersection to be able to make the future work.
Yeah, we both badly need each other is the way to put it. And I think we need you more than you need us. And what I mean by that is if we didn't exist and we play at the buyer and the infrastructure layer, because the infrastructure is the platforms, the providers, all these solutions that are the enablers and accelerators, and then the buyers, which are the ones actually paying. If we didn't exist, then to be honest, you would still exist, but you would exist in the context of startups and small businesses because they don't need the platform. They use, but they don't need the providers to do it. Now, one hard lesson that I had to learn in 2017 was that most of the money is run by large entities, whether it's government, whether it's large enterprises, you name it. the bulk of spend, and if we use like a Pareto principle, right? Like the 80% of spend and money is owned by 20% of whatever it is, right? In companies. And I had that hard learning when I was in San Francisco with Gigster, and I was loving the innovation. Like San Francisco at the time that I was there, I loved every second of it. And when Microsoft came calling, my answer was, "Oh no, you guys are old and has-beens, and I'm here in Silicon Valley, right? I'm in Silicon Valley, and this is the cool side." And I'll never forget, the leader was very accepting, right? Like he could have just said, "Okay, young kid, buzz off." But he said, "Listen, I get that. We all had that streak, but let me show you where the actual money is. So if you really want to make change, you got to learn how to move the machine," which is Microsoft, J&J, Nestle, like all like the big companies. So that is what I wake up every morning thinking about, is how to get these large companies to put freelance as a strategic sourcing channel to go spend 100 million, then $1 billion, just like they do with contractors. Now, you freelancers don't need that. And what I mean by that is, if I didn't exist, there would still be a freelance economy, but it would be 80% smaller than it could be if we brought in the enterprises. So yeah, that's my version of flirting, Sarah, to the freelancers and the freelance side. And we need people like you to make sure that the freelancers, because freelancing is tough, right? Working for yourself is freaking hard. How do you take care of benefits, time off? Do you go get 10 clients overnight? Do you go get only 5? Like, so we badly need you. And we always just say, hey, default to Sarah if it's anything on the individual freelancer side, because we have some best practices and stuff like that, but you'll always be the best.
We need each other very much. That warms my heart. It makes me very happy. And again, I think it's definitely a two-sided thing, because I am not in this just to have a flexible work life and make money and do all those things. All that stuff is great, but I'm interested in making work better for everyone. And so, like you said, in order for that to happen, it has to be both of us. We have to do it at the individual level. We have to do it at the top levels, and the medium levels, all the medium levels. So I could not thank you enough for being here and having this conversation with us. We will definitely have to have you back again soon, because I know I have 5 pages of notes and a million other things that we could touch on. But in the meantime, tell us about where we can find out more about the Human Cloud.
Yeah, so you can go to my LinkedIn, Matthew Mottola. You can search Human Cloud on LinkedIn. You can go to Human Cloud /work. There's a lot of Human Clouds, by the way. So I think you'll see us first now. 3 years ago, that wasn't the case, but now first. You can pick up the book anywhere. So if you just search Human Cloud book, pop up wherever you are. It's translated right now in South Korea. There's a couple other countries. So if you're sitting in a place that it's not translated, yell at us. We'll yell at our publishers. But no, Sarah, thank you so much for having us on, and first of many.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks for listening. If you value this content, please follow this podcast wherever you get it and leave us a positive review. You can also share the podcast with a friend. Find out more about everything that we do, including live events, coaching, and a lot more content at fruitioninitiatives.com.